July 4th, 1945. Camp Swift, Texas. Smoke curled thick across the barbed wire, carrying the scent of mesquite and slow-cooked beef into the women's barracks. 200 German prisoners sat in silence, watching American soldiers arrange checkered tablecloths on long wooden tables outside their compound. They had crossed an ocean expecting brutality. They had been promised starvation, degradation. The systematic cruelty that propaganda films had shown them would greet every prisoner in America. Instead, Sergeant William Hayes stood at a massive steel pit, turning ribs with careful attention while his wife Sarah set out mason jars of sweet tea. If this story surprised you like that Texas barbecue surprised those German women, hit like and subscribe for more Untold history. Comment where you're watching from. These stories remind us that even in war, humanity always finds a way through. The women pressed against the fence, trying to understand what was happening. None of them could reconcile the scene before them with everything they had been taught. And in that moment, watching Americans prepare a feast for their enemies, they realized that perhaps everything they had believed about this war had been a lie. The heat that afternoon pressed down like judgment itself. It shimmered off the dirt roads and wooden structures of Camp Swift, 30 miles east of Austin, distorting the horizon where oak trees stood like sentinels against an endless Texas sky. The camp sprawled across 8,000 acres of central Texas scrubland. In the western corner, separated from the male prisoner compound by 2 miles of triple-strand wire, stood the women's facility. Greta Zimmerman leaned against the barracks wall. Her Luftwaffe Auxiliary Corps insignia faded almost to nothing. She was 23 years old. Her hands trembled slightly as she watched the Americans work in the open field between guard towers. They had erected tables and brought out that strange metal contraption billowing smoke. She had been told Americans were wasteful and cruel, that German discipline and strength would inevitably triumph over their decadence. But in 6 weeks since their ship docked in New Orleans, she had seen no cruelty. The confusion was worse than hatred would have been. Beside her, Anna Becker squinted at the scene unfolding. Anna was 37, a radio operator from Hamburg whose husband had died at Stalingrad. Later, she would write in her diary that the smoke smelled nothing like the fires that had consumed her city, nothing like the phosphorus that had turned Hamburg into an inferno. This smoke carried sweetness. It made her stomach tighten with something she had forgotten was hunger. The guards had mentioned it that morning, a gathering, a celebration, Independence Day, the 4th of July. Corporal Davis, a lanky man from Oklahoma with sunburned forearms and a gap-toothed smile, had tried to explain in terrible German. "You folks are invited," he said, gesturing with his hands. "Going to be food, music. It's our birthday. America's birthday. We share with friends." Friends. The word hung in the air like something foreign and impossible. By noon, Sergeant Hayes had transformed the field into something surreal. The massive pit he had built himself from salvaged oil drums and steel grating crackled with mesquite wood he had chopped that morning. Fat dripped from racks of pork ribs, beef brisket, and chicken halves onto the coals, sending up bursts of flame that he tamped down with practiced care. His wife, Sarah, moved between tables, setting out bowls of potato salad and cornbread wrapped in cloth. The male prisoners had been brought over first. They stood in uncertain clusters, Wehrmacht regulars captured in France after D-Day, farm boys from Bavaria, factory workers from the Ruhr. They had expected work details, rock breaking, fence digging. Not this. Then the women arrived, escorted by 3 guards from the Women's Army Corps. Captain Helen Morrison led them, a schoolteacher from Iowa who spoke fluent German and believed that rehabilitation was possible. She had written in her official report that these women were not fanatics, just ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances who needed to see that America represented something different than what they had been taught. The women walked slowly, feeling every eye on them. The sun beat down mercilessly. Dust rose with each step. When they reached the field, Captain Morrison gestured toward the tables. "Please," she said in German. "Sit. Be comfortable. Comfortable." Another impossible word. The first moment of transformation came quietly. Sergeant Hayes carried a tray of ribs to the nearest table where a group of women sat frozen. He set it down gently. The bones gleamed with dark sauce, the meat pulling away tender. Steam rose in fragrant waves. "Help yourselves," Hayes said through Captain Morrison's translation. Plenty more where that came from. No one moved. The women stared at the food as if it might vanish. In Germany, rations had collapsed by 1944. Bread came in fragments. Meat was memory. Greta had not tasted pork in 18 months. She had watched children in Berlin fight over potato peels. The cognitive dissonance of abundance here, in a prison camp, while her country starved, created a paralysis she could not name. Anna reached out first. Her hand shook as she picked up a rib. She brought it to her mouth and bit down tentatively. Her eyes closed. Tears carved lines through the dust on her face before she could stop them. The meat dissolved on her tongue, tender and sweet and smoky all at once. She could not speak. She could only chew slowly, swallowing each bite as if it were sacred. The dam broke. Other women reached forward. Within moments, the table erupted in quiet eating, the sound of teeth on bone, fingers sticky with sauce. No one spoke. Speech would have required acknowledging what this meant, and that was too vast to voice. Greta took a rib. The first bite sent shock through her system. Her body, starved for so long, recognized fat and protein and flavor in a way that transcended politics or propaganda. This was sustenance as she had forgotten it could exist. She ate slowly, methodically, her eyes fixed on the table as if she might wake and find it gone. Sergeant Hayes watched from the pit. He was 41 years old, born on a ranch outside Abilene, raised on beef and mesquite smoke, and the belief that food was how you showed care. His son was fighting in the Pacific. His daughter worked in a munitions factory in Fort Worth. He understood that these women were the enemy technically, officially. But looking at them now, hollow-eyed and skeletal, eating ribs like starving people, he felt something shift in his chest. Sarah joined him, wiping her hands on her apron. "They needed this," she said quietly. Hayes nodded. He had been feeding German POWs since the camp opened in 1943, watching them slowly transform from hostile to bewildered to grateful. This was different. The women carried something darker, a resignation the men did not have. They expected nothing, which made every kindness a wound. By mid-afternoon, the initial silence gave way to tentative conversation. Male prisoners began serving food to the women, awkward and formal. American soldiers moved between tables, refilling glasses of sweet tea, carrying platters of chicken and brisket. Someone brought out a guitar. Corporal Davis, who had learned 3 chords from his grandfather, began playing a simple melody. The music stopped time. It was not the martial anthems the women knew, not the propaganda songs that had saturated German radio. This was something else, a folk tune, slow and mournful, about home and distance and longing. Several male prisoners began singing, first in English, then shifting to German words they knew fit the melody. The women listened. Some closed their eyes. Others wept openly now, past the point of hiding it. Greta sat very still. The rib bones lay clean on her plate. Her stomach, stretched with food for the first time in months, felt alien and painful and good. She watched an American soldier not much older than her brother who had died at Kursk laugh with a German prisoner about something trivial, gestures bridging the language gap. She watched Captain Morrison sit with Anna, speaking in quiet German about nothing consequential, just conversation for its own sake. Later, historians would note that the POW camps in Texas represented a unique chapter in wartime policy. The Geneva Convention required adequate food and treatment, but the American approach went further. The abundance of America, even in wartime, created a psychological weapon more effective than any propaganda. To show the enemy not cruelty but generosity, not deprivation but plenty, was to undermine the fundamental narrative they had been taught about Western decadence and inevitable Axis victory. But in that moment, on that field, under that merciless Texas sun, none of the women thought about policy or history. They thought about the food, the impossible kindness of it, and the way their world had quietly rearranged itself without permission. The barbecue continued into evening. As the sun descended toward the horizon, painting the sky amber and crimson, the heat finally broke. A breeze moved through the oak trees. Sergeant Hayes pulled the last rack of ribs from the pit while Sarah brought out peach cobbler she had made that morning, fruit sweet and sticky beneath a crust that crumbled at the touch. Greta accepted a bowl from an American private who smiled and said something she did not understand. She tasted the cobbler. The sweetness was almost painful. In Germany, sugar had vanished into memory. Dessert was a concept from childhood. The peaches, soft and warm and perfect, tasted like a world that should not exist while her country lay in ruins. She thought about her mother in Dresden if she was still alive, if the city still stood. The last letter had come 4 months ago, before the firebombing, before everything. Greta had no way of knowing what remained. But here in Texas, in a prison camp, she ate peach cobbler while American soldiers joked and prisoners smiled tentatively, and the boundary between enemy and human blurred into something she could not name. Anna sat beside her, scraping the last of the cobbler from her bowl. She spoke quietly, almost to herself. I thought they would hate us. I thought we deserved hatred. Greta did not respond immediately. She watched Sergeant Hayes load another platter, watched him distribute food with the same care he might show family. She watched Captain Morrison laugh at something a prisoner said. She watched Corporal Davis try to teach several younger women a dance step clumsy and earnest and ridiculous. They should hate us, Greta said finally, but they feed us instead. As darkness fell, someone lit lanterns. They hung from poles driven into the ground, casting warm yellow light across the tables. The guitar music continued, joined now by a harmonica that one of the prisoners had been allowed to keep. The melody drifted across the field, mingling with laughter and the low murmur of a conversation in 2 languages. Sergeant Hayes sat on a bench near the pit, the coals still glowing faintly. Sarah brought him a plate of brisket and cornbread. He ate slowly, watching the prisoners eat, watching the guards relax, watching the war dissolve for a few hours into something resembling normalcy. A young woman approached him tentatively. She was perhaps 19, thin as wire, her uniform hanging loose. She spoke in broken English. "Thank you. The food, thank you." Hayes nodded. "You're welcome, miss. You need more. You just holler." She did not understand holler, but grasped the meaning. She smiled, fragile and brief, then returned to her table. Hayes watched her go. He thought about his daughter, about the letters she sent from the munitions factory where she assembled shells that might have killed this girl's brothers or father. The cognitive loops were impossible to resolve. So he focused on what was immediate hunger and food, deprivation and abundance, the simple transactional grace of providing a meal. Captain Morrison joined him, carrying a glass of tea. "Hell of a day." Hayes grunted agreement. They eat like they forgot food could taste good. Most of them probably did. Morrison watched the women at the tables. The younger ones had started to relax, talking among themselves with more animation. The older women remained quiet, but their shoulders had lost some of the rigid tension they carried everywhere. "They're not monsters," Morrison continued. "They're just people who believed the wrong things." Hayes considered this. His son's letters from the Pacific spoke of Japanese soldiers who fought with suicidal intensity, convinced of divine righteousness. The propaganda war was as real as the shooting war. But here in Texas, with barbecue and peach cobbler and lantern light, the propaganda could not sustain itself against the evidence of kindness. "You think this changes anything?" Hayes asked. "Long term, when they go home?" Morrison sipped her tea. "I think it plants a seed. Maybe that's enough." By 10 o'clock, the field began to clear. Guards gently suggested it was time to return to barracks. The women rose slowly, reluctantly, as if afraid the day might vanish with the darkness. They filed past the tables, past Sergeant Hayes, who nodded to each of them, past the cooling pit where the smell of mesquite still lingered. Greta walked with Anna and several others through the cool night air. Stars spread above strange constellations in a different world. Anna asked softly, "What do we do with this? How do we carry this?" No one answered. They'd been taught Americans were weak, that German strength would triumph, but strength had led to ruin. And here, prisoners ate better than civilians in Berlin. Liesel, once in an anti-aircraft unit, said, "My father told me Americans would work us to death. I don't know what to believe anymore." In the weeks after, the barbecue became a touchstone. Hostility faded into cautious respect. Captain Morrison noted fewer incidents. Women asked about Texas, requested English books. Hayes kept cooking with quiet care his mother had taught him. Food meant someone mattered. One August afternoon, Greta thanked him. "We are prisoners, but you are kind," she said. Then, helplessly in German, "Es gibt keinen Sinn." Hayes didn't speak German, but he understood. Nothing makes sense, war least of all. They stood in silence as heat shimmered across the camp. Prisoners and guards worked together along the fence, the line between enemy and ally blurred. "Keep your head down," Hayes said. "War will end soon. Build something better." Greta nodded, uncertain what home meant now. Dresden might be rubble, her family gone. Home was a memory without a place. She thought of the barbecue, the ribs, cobbler, and impossible kindness of abundance shared freely, of Hayes serving food like a father, of soldiers who smiled instead of sneered. Maybe that was the seed Captain Morrison meant. Not propaganda, but generosity. Not enemies, but humans choosing kindness over cruelty. By December, the war was over. As the camp closed, Hayes held one last barbecue. Under cold Texas skies, Greta realized that kindness itself was the lesson. Captain Morrison approached carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She handed one to Greta. "Going to miss this place?" Greta considered the question. "Miss is not the right word, but I will remember." "What will you remember most?" Greta gestured toward the pit. "This, the food. The way you showed us we were wrong about everything." Morrison smiled, sad and genuine. "We're just people. That's all we ever tried to show you." "But that was the lesson," Greta said. "We were taught you were less than people. Soft, decadent, weak. But you were stronger than us precisely because you could afford to be kind." They stood in silence, watching the smoke rise. Hayes pulled the meat from the pit and began carving brisket, his movements practiced and sure. Other women gathered around the tables, talking quietly among themselves. The male prisoners from the adjacent compound arrived, escorted by guards who no longer bothered with weapons. Everyone knew no one was running. There was nowhere to run to and nothing to run from. The food was distributed. Greta took a plate of brisket and cornbread and found a seat beside Anna. They ate slowly, savoring the meal not just for the taste, but for the symbolism of it. The last supper before exile, before the journey home to a country that no longer existed as they had known it. Anna spoke quietly. "What will you tell people about this place?" Greta thought about the question. The truth would sound absurd that American soldiers had been kind, that they had been fed better as prisoners than as citizens, that the enemy had shown them more humanity than their own government ever had. No one would believe it. Or if they believed it, they would call her a traitor for speaking it. "I will tell them we survived," Greta said finally. "That is enough." But Anna pressed. "You won't tell them about the barbecues, about Sergeant Hayes, about everything here?" Greta looked at her friend. Anna's face had filled out over the months. The hollow-eyed desperation of July had been replaced by something more solid, more present. The food had literally rebuilt her. They had all been rebuilt physically and psychologically by the simple act of being fed well and treated fairly. "I will tell them in my own way," Greta said. "Maybe not in words, but in how I live, in what I teach my children, if I have children, that the enemy can be kind, that propaganda is lies, that people are just people everywhere, trying to survive." The final barbecue lasted into the evening. As darkness fell and lanterns were lit, someone brought out a guitar. Music began softly, then voices joined German and English, mingling in songs of home, longing, and hope beyond the horizon. Sergeant Hayes sat with his wife Sarah, watching the prisoners sing. His work was nearly done. Soon they'd all go home to rebuild or survive. He would return to his ranch, but something in him had changed. Feeding the enemy had shown him that enemy was only a word. Sarah squeezed his hand. "You did a good thing." Hayes shrugged. "Just fed people." "No," she said, "you showed them we're not what they were told." Hayes thought of how war thrived on dehumanization. The barbecues had been small acts of rehumanization. Greta approached, thanking him. He wished her well. Under the Texas stars, the fire burned low, and for one night the war was held at bay.